Welcome to our channel. If you love emotional and engaging love stories, then come to our channel here. We will bring you stories full of surprises, touching and engaging. Don't forget to click the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any interesting stories. In today's video, we would like to send you a story called 3 Rooms and the Gardener, narrated by Jane. Please follow along. That day was a hot summer afternoon. The weather was blazing hot. Mr. John, a farmer nearly 50 years old with a sturdy figure because he was used to working in the fields since childhood, slowly walked to the large 3-room house deep in the deserted village road. For many years he had heard that this was the home of Mrs. Ella, a rich woman, but her life was lonely. The house was hidden behind rows of tall, straight trees, providing cool shade. Mr. John stopped in front of the gate, pensively looking through the high fence. This house looked different, not only because of its large size, but also because of the luxurious attention to detail. Mr. John felt a little shy, standing there hesitantly calling out, "Hello, is anyone home?" His voice echoed in the quiet space, but no one answered. He waited a moment and tried calling again, still silence. Mr. John was about to turn away when from afar came a clacking sound like wooden clogs hitting the brick floor, accompanied by the barking of a dog from inside the house. Immediately after that, a woman's voice said, "Who is it?" Mr. John cleared his throat and asked louder, "Hello, do you need a gardener?" The gate creaked slightly. From the porch stepped out a woman wearing a dark brown au-baba, slim figure, wooden clogs gently stepping on the gravel path, creating a slightly ear-piercing rustling sound. Mrs. Ella, the landlady, walked towards Mr. John, her delicate eyes filled with curiosity, but not too hasty. "Please wait for me a moment." Mrs. Ella smiled gently, but contained something that Mr. John could not read clearly. Mrs. Ella, seen from afar, had the gentle beauty of a woman nearly 40 years old, tall and slim but exuding nobility. Her eyes seemed to hide a deep inner world, completely opposite to her gentle and leisurely appearance on the outside. Mr. John was slightly surprised, because until now he had only heard rumours about Mrs. Ella, that she was rich but lonely, that her life was full of sadness. But meeting her in person, this woman had something attractive that could not be described in words. Mrs. Ella unlocked the gate and stepped closer, her gentle eyes looking at Mr. John. "When did you come? Did you wait long for me?" Her voice was gentle, a bit caring, making Mr. John feel a strange intimacy. "Yes, I just arrived. No one answered after calling for a long time," Mr. John said shyly, following Mrs. Ella into the house. The path to the house was surrounded by rows of green areca trees, the shade covering the road, softening the intense heat of the afternoon. Colourful pots of Ella trees were interspersed with fresh green bushes, all carefully cared for, showing that the homeowner was a person with an aesthetic eye and loved nature. "You can call me Miss Ella, don't call me Mrs. It sounds too old." Mrs. Ella smiled and said, "I'm not yet 40. "Then I'll call you Miss Ella, and I'm high." "Mr." John ventured to say, not knowing if such a form of address was rude, but seeing that Mrs. Ella didn't object, he felt somewhat reassured. Entering the large 3-room house, Mr. John stood hesitantly in front of the door. The floor was paved with shiny tiles. Looking at it immediately showed luxury. Mr. John was worried that his dirty feet would dirty the floor, so he didn't dare to step in. Mrs. Ella smiled and urged, "Please come in and sit down." "It's okay. Let me get you some water." Mr. John sat timidly on a rosewood chair in the middle of the house. He looked around at each pillar and each wall, all of which were made of precious wood and were intricately carved. This was the first time in his life that he had sat on such a luxurious chair. This house was not only large, but also exuded nobility and wealth. Mrs. Ella quickly brought out a glass of cool water and a plate of fruit. Putting the glass of water down in front of Mr. John, she sat down opposite him, her face bright as she said, "No one has taken care of the garden for a long time. The trees are growing wildly. I want to renovate the garden to grow some vegetables to eat. Can you help me?" Mr. John smiled and took the glass of water from her hand. "Don't worry. I've been gardening for many years. It will probably be done in a few days." Mrs. Ella's eyes lit up with a bit of joy. "I heard from my nephew that you are famous for being careful in your work, so I asked you to help." Mrs. Ella talked to Mr. John for a few more sentences, her voice gentle, not at all distant or arrogant like he often heard about other rich people. She was a different woman that was evident in her every word and look. However, there was something in the way she spoke that made Mr. John feel a bit strange, as if she had unspeakable feelings in her heart. After chatting for a while, Mrs. Ella slowly told about her life, her face sad, her voice low, as if she was sinking into a distant past. "I had a husband before, but he left me because I couldn't give him a child." She sighed softly, her eyes looking far away out the window. "We lived together for many years but still had no children. I don't know if it was because of me or because of him. In the end, I had to let him go, let him find new happiness." Mr. John listened silently, feeling sorry for himself. He looked at her, a beautiful, rich woman, but carrying within her an indelible pain. He didn't know what to say. He could only clearly feel the loneliness enveloping her. Every word she said was like a knife cutting into the listener's heart, full of resentment and sadness. "You're still young. Why don't you find someone to keep you company?" Mr. John spoke after a moment of silence. "Anyway, having someone to take care of me day and night is better than being alone." Mrs. Ella turned back and smiled sadly. "I'm used to it. It's been a long time. I don't care about having a husband or not, but sometimes I still long to be a mother. But maybe that's something I will never have." In that moment, Mr. John looked at Mrs. Ella, feeling deep in her eyes an endless longing, a long-suppressed desire, not just the desire to have children, but also the desire to be loved and cherished. That made him feel strangely moved. Every detail, every word of Mrs. Ella was like a piece of a puzzle of a life full of twists and turns. Although Mr. John was just a hired worker, from that moment he felt that the relationship between the two of them would not stop at gardening. A strange feeling blossomed in his heart. The next morning Mr. John carried his familiar hoe and went to Mrs. Ella's house early. Although the noon sun was hot, he still felt the air was a bit hot, but he was full of determination. Under the summer sun, gardening seemed to be very hard work, but Mr. John was used to working, so he was not worried about that. When he arrived at the gate, he was surprised to see Mrs. Ella standing on the porch, her face brighter than yesterday. She was wearing a white aubaba and soft silk pants. Ella's clothes were simple but still exuded the elegance of a rich woman. Her smile made Mr. John a little confused. "You're here so early. Come in and have a glass of water before going to work. There's no need to rush," Mrs. Ella said in a caring voice. "Mr." John bowed his head and replied, "No need to bother you. I'll try to finish early so that the weather is still cool." "No need to bother. Please come in. There's work to do in a lifetime, but health is the most important." Mrs. Ella insisted on inviting him. Mr. John hesitated for a moment before entering the house, unable to refuse her enthusiasm. He still felt a little embarrassed by the beauty of his mistress, an attraction that he could not explain. Entering the house, he sat down on the luxurious rosewood chair from yesterday. The house still exuded wealth and warmth, but this morning there was the presence of sunlight shining through the window, making everything more sparkling. Mrs. Ella poured Mr. John a glass of cool lemonade. placing it on the table with a gentle smile. She sat down opposite, her eyes sparkling as if examining every expression of Mr. John. "Mr. Hi, I really appreciate your helping me with the garden. This house is too big. I can't take care of it alone. It's been so many years since I touched any land." "No problem. I'm used to gardening. It will probably be done in a few days," Mr. John said, but his eyes still did not leave Mrs. Ella's gentle expression. Mrs. Ella looked at Mr. John attentively, her lips moving as if she wanted to say something, but then she fell silent. Her eyes suddenly looked out to the empty yard outside, where the sunlight had begun to spread. "This garden is really beautiful, but there are too many weeds all overgrown," Mrs. Ella said softly, her eyes still following the bushes outside. Mr. John nodded and stood up, picking up the hoe. "I'll go out to the garden to do it. You can rest assured to leave it to me." Mrs. Ella smiled slightly, watching Mr. John's figure walk out. There seemed to be something indescribable in her eyes, a deep feeling that she herself did not dare to express. That afternoon, after working all morning in the sun, Mr. John decided to take a break. Mrs. Ella's garden was indeed very large. The weeds grew up to her knees. But with his skills and experience, Mr. John had cleared a large part of it. Sweating profusely, he sat down on a rock next to the garden, quickly wiping a few drops of sweat from his forehead. At that moment, Mrs. Ella came out of the house with a plate of cool fruit and a glass of lemonade. "Take a break, have some fruit, and then continue working. You've worked enough since morning." Her voice was gentle, sweet, and full of concern. Mr. John could not refuse her enthusiastic care, so he took the glass of water from her hand and took a long sip. The cool water cooled the heat that was burning his body. He looked up at Mrs. Ella, surprised to see that she was wearing a thin t-shirt and white silk pants, neater than yesterday's three-piece outfit. The shirt hugged her body, highlighting her slim figure. "It's so sunny today, Ella. Why are you out here? Just let me take care of this garden," Mr. John said, his heart filled with worry when he saw her standing in the sunlight. "Don't worry, I won't do anything heavy. I just want to come out here to admire the garden." Mrs. Ella smiled lightly, sat down next to Mr. John, her eyes looking far away at the cleared land. Mr. John did not say anything more, but felt Mrs. Ella's close presence made his heart flutter. She was not only beautiful, but also very delicate, making him not know how to respond. Suddenly, Mrs. Ella spoke. "Mr. Hi, have you ever thought about living a different life before? I mean, have you ever felt like you wanted to change, do something for yourself?" Her question made Mr. John pause. He had never thought about this. His life from birth until now had only known manual labour, living in the worries of rural life. He loved his wife and children, but he could not deny that sometimes he had desires, wishes that he never dared to think of. "I have never thought about that. My life is too familiar. I also do not wish for anything more than to be able to take care of my wife and children." Mrs. Ella was silent for a moment, then spoke softly, her voice carrying a hint of melancholy. "You are so lucky, having a wife and children. Your life has a goal, someone to share it with. As for me, I am alone, living day by day in this house. Everything is meaningless." The atmosphere suddenly became quiet. Mr. John did not know what to say. He just felt his heart heavy when he saw the deep sadness in Mrs. Ella's eyes. Suddenly Mrs. Ella stood up, walked towards the door, but then turned back, her eyes sparkling as she looked at Mr. John. "If one day you feel tired of your current life, remember that there is always someone here ready to listen to you." Mrs. Ella's words were like a hidden suggestion, making Mr. John confused. He nodded, but in his heart there seemed to be a strange feeling rising. Day after day, Mr. John still regularly went to Mrs. Ella's house to work. Every time he came, Mrs. Ella took good care of him, not only with water and fruit, but also talked to him more. Her concern became more and more intimate, and Mr. John began to feel a warmth that he had not felt for a long time. One afternoon, after finishing work, Mrs. Ella sat next to Mr. John under the shade of a large tree in the garden, but this time Mrs. Ella not only talked, but her eyes were also filled with indescribable emotions. "Mr. High, do you know?" "Mrs." Ella said softly, her deep eyes looking at him. "It's been a long time since I felt this close to a man. Since my husband left, I've lived alone, with no one to share with." Mr. John was startled, not knowing how to respond. Her words were too straightforward, but also full of sincerity, as if she had suppressed these emotions for too long. "Miss Ella, I understand," Mr. John said, his heart in turmoil. "But I am a married man. I can't—" Mrs. Ella did not let him finish his sentence. She grabbed his hand, her eyes looking straight at him with a pleading, "Mr. High, I don't want you to leave your family. I just want someone to be by your side, someone to share with. I just want to feel closeness, to be loved like a normal woman." Mr. John's emotions at this moment seemed to be caught in a spiral with no way out. His male instincts rose, but his reason still held him back. He felt his heart beat faster, his breathing became more rapid. The woman in front of him was not only a rich boss, but also a person full of desire, looking for love. That evening, after finishing work, Mr. John was about to go home when it suddenly started to rain heavily. Mrs. Ella begged him to stay overnight because it was too dark and raining heavily, making it inconvenient to go home. "You stay. It's not safe to go back in this heavy rain. My house is big. There's an empty room. You can stay for the night. Come back tomorrow morning," Mrs. Ella said, her eyes full of concern. Mr. John paused and then nodded in agreement. His heart was full of worry, but he didn't know how to refuse. Mrs. Ella led him into an empty room. The room was simply decorated but cozy. High sat on the edge of the bed. His heart was in turmoil with thousands of thoughts. Outside, the sound of rain was still falling, mixed with Mrs. Ella's sighs from the hallway. In the dark night, Mrs. Ella walked into the room, her eyes sparkling in the darkness. Her words were gentle but full of hidden meaning, like an invitation that Mr. John couldn't refuse. The room was strangely silent. Only the sound of rain falling outside was like the silent beat of time. Mr. John sat on the edge of the bed, his hands trembling slightly as Mrs. Ella walked into the room. She stood there, the dim light from the hallway shining on her face, highlighting her beauty, both seductive and sad. Mrs. Ella spoke softly but emotionally. "Mr. High, I know this is not right, but for so many years I have lived alone, with no one to share with. Do you understand that feeling? Lying alone every night in this big house, I feel so lonely that I think I will disappear. Mr. John looked up, his eyes filled with confusion. He was a simple man, living by his hands, but had never faced a situation like this. His heart was torn between right and wrong, between new emotions and responsibility to his family. But the weakness in Mrs. Ella's eyes, combined with her voice, had awakened something deep inside him. "Ella, I understand you, but I am a married man. I cannot do anything wrong to my wife and children." Mr. John spoke, his voice trembling, but even he himself was not sure about the words he had just said. Emotions and reason seemed to be fighting in every word he uttered. Mrs. Ella moved closer, sat down next to him, her eyes looking straight at him as if penetrating the shell of reason. "Mr. High, I don't ask anything from you. I just want to feel the warmth and closeness of a man once. I don't need you to change your life. I just need to be loved once." She gently touched Mr. John's hand, Her cold hands made him shiver. His emotions suddenly flared up, more intense than ever. His heart was pounding, drops of sweat dripped down, but he still didn't dare to face the fact that he also craved this feeling of closeness. Mrs. Ella was still sitting there very close, her hands lightly touching Mr. John, making his body unconsciously, gradually. He looked down at those hands and then looked up at her. The secret charm in the way she spoke, the sad but determined eyes had made him lose his way. In that moment, Mr. John knew that everything was out of his control. Outside, the sound of rain was getting heavier and heavier, like a warning from nature of the wrong things that were about to happen. But in this small room, the rain seemed to be just a faint sound. In the suffocating atmosphere, Ella continued softly, her voice breaking with each word. "You know, I've never dared to dream much. I just wish for once, Mr. High. Just once I could live with my true feelings. Maybe you don't understand this pain, but I've endured it for too long." Mr. John looked at her, his eyes confused. "Miss Ella, I don't know what to say, but I really can't. I don't want to betray my wife and children." "Mrs." Ella smiled quietly, a sad smile but full of determination. She bowed her head, sighed softly, and stood up. But instead of walking out of the room, she turned back and walked closer to Mr. John, her eyes becoming sharper. "You can say you don't want to, but your heart cannot lie," she said in a hoarse but powerful voice. Her hand rested on Mr. John's shoulder, the touch as gentle as an urge. "I don't want to destroy your family, you understand that. But if you walk out this door today, you will miss out on what we can share together." Her words were like a strong invitation, making Mr. John's reason gradually waver. He felt the tension in the air, the attraction from the woman in front of him, and the long suppressed desire. Ella looked deeply into Mr. John's eyes and smiled softly. "I won't force you, but I think you want this too." Mrs. Ella's words poured into Mr. John's ears, making his mind dizzy. The closeness, the whispers, all like a strong wind blowing away all the barriers in his heart. He stood up and looked into her eyes, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that he was standing on the brink of a wrong decision, but his reason had completely failed. His hand reached out and gently touched Ella's shoulder. She shivered slightly, but did not show any surprise. Her eyes were still looking at him with anticipation and longing. Mr. John felt there was no way back. All he could think of at that moment was instinct, a strong urge from his heart. In that moment, the sound of the rain outside suddenly became quieter, as if waiting for something. The two stood facing each other in emotional silence. Mr. John gently pulled Ella closer to him, and without thinking much, he placed his lips on hers. The kiss was hesitant at first, but then became more intense as both of them were caught up in the flow of emotions. Ella returned the kiss, her arms wrapped around Mr. John's back, pulling him closer. The emotions that had been suppressed for so long now arose, unstoppable. Both of them were immersed in that moment. All boundaries between right and wrong became blurred. In a small room in the middle of a quiet rainy night, Mr. John and Mrs. Ella crossed the line from which they could not return. Intense emotions surged like waves against the shore, unstoppable. In the moments that followed, the room became a place where two lonely people found comfort in each other, found love buried under the shell of life. After everything was over, Mr. John lay still, his eyes looking at the ceiling, his heart filled with regret. He could not believe that he had done that. Beside him, Mrs. Ella lay still, a satisfied smile on her lips, but her joy could not erase the pain that was gnawing at Mr. John's soul. Mrs. Ella turned to him. He placed his hand on his chest and whispered, "Thank you. You have brought me the happiness I have longed for so long." But in Mr. John's heart, Those words only added to his guilt. He knew that his life would never be the same again. He himself has betrayed his gentle wife at home, who has shared his hardships with him over the years. In the dark night, the sound of falling rain still echoes outside, but this time it is no longer a peaceful sound. For Mr. John, it is a reminder that he has gone too far, and the consequences of this will be inevitable. Can Mr. John continue to live with this regret? Or will Miss Ella change his life in ways he did not expect? The following days will be a series of events intertwined with calculations and inner struggles as they face their decisions and mistakes. As time passes, the relationship between Mr. John and Miss Ella becomes deeper, but also mysterious and dark. Mr. John still comes to work at Miss Ella's house every day, but not just for work. Every time it got dark, that house became the place where he and Ella shared moments of ecstasy and desire, even though he knew it was wrong. But once he crossed that line, Mr. John could not turn back. As the days passed, the pangs of conscience weighed heavily on Mr. John. Every time he came home and saw his wife and children, he could not help but feel guilty. His wife, a hard-working woman who loved her husband and children, had no idea that her husband was engaging in a dangerous relationship. His son, a child in his teens, trusted his father completely. Neither of them had any doubts about Mr. John's change. But then the fateful day came. One afternoon, Mr. John came to Ella's house again. The sky that day was gloomy, as if foreshadowing a major event. In the familiar small room, Mr. John and Mrs. Ella were once again caught up in the whirlwind of desire. Despite everything, while both were immersed in intense lovemaking, Mr. John's wife and son came to find them outside. They had been suspicious of Mr. John's change for many days. His wife realized that her husband no longer came home on time, always avoiding questions when asked. She decided to ask her son to follow and discover the unusual things. Today she decided to go with her son to Mrs. Ella's house, the place she had heard her husband mention when talking about gardening. When she arrived at the gate, Mr. John's wife saw that the house was quiet and the gate was unlocked. She walked in, her heart filled with worry. Her son, who was following behind, was also bewildered. The two approached the room at the back of the house, where a faint light was shining from the open window. Mr. John's wife walked closer, and then she heard unmistakable sounds coming from inside. She stood still as if the whole world was collapsing before her eyes. Her son also heard it, his eyes filled with surprise and anger. They could not believe what they were witnessing. Mr. John's son's 3 calls rang out like a thunderclap. Mr. John stopped, his body frozen for a moment. His hands and feet turned cold when he recognized the voice of his only son. Mr. John's wife pushed the door open and entered. The scene before her eyes made her choke. On the bed, Mr. John and Mrs. Ella were in an undeniable position. Mrs. Ella was also startled, trying to hide everything, but it was too late. "Oh my God!" Mr. John's wife exclaimed, her voice breaking with each word. What have you done?" Mr. John stood up, his face pale, unable to speak. He did not expect the truth to be exposed so nakedly and painfully. His son stood there, his eyes filled with disappointment and indignation, not saying a word, just looking straight at his father. Mrs. Ella tried to calm down, but her face was pale. She looked at Mr. John's wife, then turned to him, but knew that there was nothing more to say. Everything had been discovered. There was no place to hide. Mr. John's wife approached her husband, her eyes filled with anger and pain. "What have you done? Have you betrayed me and our child like this? How have you been able to lie for so long?" Mr. John lowered his head, not daring to face his wife. He knew that an apology at this moment could not make up for the pain his wife and children were suffering. Mr. John's son stood still for a moment, then walked over. He looked straight at his father, his voice dry. I didn't expect you to do this to my mother and me." He turned away and left, without a word of reproach, but that action made Mr. John feel even heavier. He walked away with a cold look, but Mr. John understood that his son had lost all faith in the father he had always respected. Mr. John's wife couldn't keep calm. She burst into tears, tears falling like a rushing waterfall, making her shoulders shake. Mr. John tried to reach out to say something but couldn't. "You've destroyed this family. You've made me lose the husband I once trusted. I can't look at you any more, Hi," his wife sobbed, her eyes red and filled with tears. She turned and left the room, leaving Mr. John standing there, alone in the tense space. Mrs. Ella silently watched Mr. John's wife's figure disappear into the darkness, then turned to Mr. John with blurred eyes. "Mr. Hi, I'm sorry. I didn't know things would come to this." Mrs. Ella spoke quietly, her voice full of regret, but that apology seemed to be unable to change anything. It was all too late. Mr. John stood still, his heart filled with emptiness. His family was destroyed. What he had with his wife and children was now just broken pieces that could not be repaired. After that day, Mr. John returned home, but everything was no longer the same. His wife packed her things and took her son out of the house. She could not continue living with the husband who had betrayed her. Although his son did not say it, his eyes were filled with hatred and disappointment. Mr. John was left alone in the empty house, quietly living with loneliness and guilt. He could not forgive himself for losing everything just because of a few wrong moments. Every night he tossed and turned, unable to sleep. The image of his wife and children leaving kept appearing before his eyes, like a haunting ghost that never disappeared. As for Mrs. Ella, she continued to live in her large house, but no longer felt any joy from her relationship with Mr. John. She understood that she had contributed to the destruction of a family's life, and that made her unable to rest in peace. Although she had once longed for closeness, the price she and Mr. John had to pay was too high. Both Mr. John and Mrs. Ella were bound by irreparable regret. Each carried deep mental scars. Their lives were now just a series of lonely days, living in the darkness of mistakes that could not be turned back. And the tragic ending was predetermined. Mr. John lost his family. Mrs. Ella was immersed in loneliness and remorse, and neither of them could ever find peace in their lives again. Our story today will stop here. Thank you for taking the time to watch the entire video. Hopefully the details and emotions in the story have brought you interesting and meaningful moments. If you like this video, don't forget to like, share and leave a comment below the video to let me know your opinion. And don't forget to click the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any stories in the future. Each of your subscribe buttons and a like will be the motivation to help Jane and the program production team have the motivation to create more attractive videos. And now see you in the next videos. Wish you a great day.